Hey guys, tonight we are sailing into a part of Viking history that very few talk about, the strange towering world of giants, and the Vikings who feared them, honored them, and sometimes even claimed to be their kin. You stand now at the edge of the known world, where the cold air bites at your skin and the northern sky seems to brood with restless, unspoken stories. Beneath your boots, the ground feels uncertain, half frozen and waiting, as if it too remembers what you are about to hear. You probably won't survive this if you stepped into their world for real. Their dreams, their fears, their colossal nightmares might swallow you whole. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like, share your location and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along the rocky shorelines of Scandinavia, where the harsh cry of seabirds slices through the salted air. Even the land itself seems rugged enough to have birthed monsters. Stone cliffs clawed by wind, forests so dense they swallow the sun, and glaciers that grind mountains into dust. It is here that the Norse imagination formed its most primal fears. Giants, or Jötnar, towering beings of ice and stone, wild nature given a face. You hear their names whispered in the sagas: Thrym, king of the frost giants; Hrungnir, whose heart was made of solid stone; Skadi, the snowshoed huntress striding across the peaks. These beings are not simply enemies in old stories. They are an echo of something much older, a primal terror that the landscape itself seemed to breathe out, night after night. Some Viking storytellers made these giants monstrous, the enemies of the gods, always scheming to destroy Asgard's walls. But other tales complicate the picture. You see hints of respect, a nod to their ancient power, to the way they ruled before even Odin shaped the world. Historians still argue whether these tales began as cautionary fables for children, or as serious warnings grown men took to heart when storms howled across the fjords. It is not hard to imagine yourself sitting near a smoky hearth, listening to a gray-bearded skald chant stories of giants so huge their footsteps crack the earth, their voices rolling like thunder. You feel a chill pass through you, thinking about it, the same chill that must have crept into Viking bones when the weather turned, when winter refused to end, when crops failed. It was comforting, in a strange way, to blame such miseries on towering forces beyond human measure. Even today, the idea of a giant stirs something deep in you, doesn't it? That sense of being very, very small, as if the world itself might not care whether you live or die. For the Vikings, whose lives balanced on the edge of cold and hunger, this fear was more than a fairy tale. It was a worldview, a reminder that you are never in control, no matter how sharp your sword or how sturdy your ship. You picture the coastline again, the long winter shadows creeping across the shallows, and in those dark places, you sense that something could still be watching. A hint of shape among the crags, too big, too silent, waiting. A boulder might not be a boulder, a cliff might not be a cliff. That is how the giants lived in Viking minds, hidden, half real, half dream, ready to rise if they were provoked. And you wonder, what did it feel like to genuinely believe these beings walked the same lands? To light a candle not just to Odin or Thor, but to hold back the rage of something older, more raw, something with a heart of ice and bones of mountain. The sagas rarely pause to explain, but you catch glimpses between their verses, like frost forming on glass. The skald might chant of Thor's hammer smashing a giant's skull, yes. But notice how often the gods only barely survive those encounters. That balance, that constant threat, was baked into the Viking mind. the sense that even the gods could be crushed by a giant's fury if they grew careless. There is a sort of beauty in that, don't you think? A humility woven into their myths. You are small, they said, but you are also cunning and clever and quick enough to dodge disaster if you respect the giants. In the end, that idea has a strange comfort to it. The world is terrifying, yes, but there are rules to the terror, and you can learn to live with them. So, you settle closer to the hearth of these stories, listening as the wind rattles the walls, as your breath makes a small cloud in the winter air. The old voice carries on, telling you of worlds beyond worlds, of 9 realms and the monstrous children of night, and always, somewhere on the horizon, a giant shape moving through the dusk. You might want to pull your cloak tighter, because in the Viking imagination, the giant was never far away. It stood just past the next ridge, or behind the next wave, an echo of raw nature given eyes and voice. You do not command it. You only hope to survive it, and that, friend, is where you begin to understand. Giants were more than monsters. They were the shape of fear itself, the living spirit of storm and cold and hunger. If you worship them, you were not only bowing to a being, you were bowing to the hard truth that nature itself was your master. The fire pops, the night grows deeper, and your mind drifts further into the fog of these old tales. Let that rhythm hold you for now as we prepare to slip deeper into the next chapter, where you will see how some Vikings crossed a line, honoring these giants with offerings and respect. You keep the cold night close around you, the way a wolf keeps its ragged fur, stepping carefully through memories and myths that still leave their marks on the mind. Here, you find a truth that feels strange, maybe even unthinkable. Some Vikings didn't just fear giants, they worship them. You move inland, away from the shore, across ridges spattered with ice. Little homesteads huddle together under dark pine forests, smoke curling up to vanish into a pale winter sky. In these hidden places, stories say, there were men and women who turned their eyes not toward Odin, not toward Thor, but toward Jötnar, the realm of giants. A harsh devotion, you might say, but also a logical one. After all, if you truly believed these unstoppable forces ruled the wind, the harvest, the mountains, then giving them offerings made a certain sense. You might light a candle for Thor to defend you, but maybe you also left a share of food in the forest to soothe a giant who could flatten your home with one careless stomp. The sagas don't dwell on these people, these quiet worshippers, but hints slip through the cracks. A broken runestone here, a half-remembered folk verse there. One curious detail preserved in a medieval bishop's report describes a family leaving cuts of whale meat by the fjord, whispering names that do not match any known gods. Historians still argue whether this was worship of a giant or merely superstition, but you can picture it. Salted fish laid gently on the rocks, a prayer for peace from something big and cold and angry. You wonder what it felt like to stand on a rocky ledge in the half-light, holding the meat or bread or coin, to glance over your shoulder, sure you felt something watching, a presence in the forest, impossible to see, impossible to name, yet so real you could feel its breath. The people who left these offerings probably went home with a slightly lighter heart, thinking they had bought one more day of safety. It's almost funny, in a dark sort of way, how humans try to negotiate with their fears. You do it even now, in the modern world, tapping a lucky charm, knocking on wood, crossing your fingers before an important test. Back then, in a world full of unpredictable storms, disease, and hunger, the giants became the ultimate fear to bargain with. One rune poem, barely preserved, hints that a farmer's family tied a silver ring to a birch tree as a gift to Skadi, the huntress giantess of winter. If true, It's a glimpse of worship that blurs the line between giant and god. She was terrifying, yes, but also a bringer of snow that could feed rivers in spring. Imagine praying to something that might starve you one year and save you the next. That double-edged power demanded respect. The stories you grew up with, about heroes smashing giants, about gods conquering chaos, were always a bit too neat, weren't they? Out here, in the ragged edge of the Viking world, those stories were more tangled. You get the sense these worshippers didn't see giants as mere villains, but as a kind of neighbor, a neighbor who might crush your fence if you didn't say good morning. And why not? The harsh Nordic lands gave giants a certain logic. Towering cliffs, bone-breaking storms, glaciers grinding the world apart. You could almost see a giant's hand behind it all. The Vikings knew their gods were warlike and arrogant, but the giants were raw nature itself, unstoppable, older than anything. Maybe that deserved an offering. There's a fringe theory, too, passed around like a rumor at the edge of a museum tour, that some Viking warbands adopted giant worship to stand apart, to claim a kind of wild independence. If you worship the gods, you serve their laws. But if you worship the giants, you answer to no one. You live by the rules of frost and stone, and nobody else's. That's a rebel's prayer, in its own cold and lonely way. As you follow these quiet trails, you feel the hush in your own chest, the sense of something vast and ancient that cannot be bribed, only respected. And maybe you catch a whiff of that fear yourself, a chill in your spine, as if the pine forest might reach out and swallow you whole, should you forget to pay it homage. You hear a raven's cry, high and sharp, as you turn back toward a dimly lit hall, smoke rising from its turf roof. Inside, men boast of Thor's victories over giants, pounding tables with mugs of beer. But you know that somewhere, maybe even in that very same hall, someone is quietly, secretly, leaving a scrap of bread at the threshold for Thrym, King of Frost. That quiet tension sits at the heart of the Viking worldview. You are both conqueror and worshipper, both brave and terrified. You stand upright before the gods, but you bow before the oldest powers of the land, hoping they will pass you by. As you settle onto a rough wooden bench, warming your hands at the central fire, you feel that sense of respect settle in with you. The giants are there, waiting beyond the walls. You might laugh at the gods, but you do not laugh at the mountains. Sleepy yet? Not quite? Good, because next you will see how the very landscape itself shaped these beliefs, making giants seem as real as any flesh and blood creature you might meet on a dark road. You rise from the bench, letting the warmth of the hearth fade behind you as you step out into the night again, where the wind tastes of iron and the earth seems as solid as a giant's knuckle. The world around you feels raw, unfinished, as if the gods themselves forgot to smooth out the corners. And in that broken, unyielding place, you start to see how belief in giants became something more than a bedtime story. The Northland is not gentle. You walk across a landscape gouged by glaciers, where mountains loom with cruel indifference. A valley might flood overnight. A landslide might bury your entire field without warning. Storms come off the North Atlantic, screaming like wolves. Thunder shakes your bones. You do not need to invent monsters to explain these terrors, but if you call them giants, well, somehow that makes them easier to name. There's a kind of comfort in naming your enemy. If you call a rock slide the hand of a giant, you feel you can predict its anger, maybe even avoid it next time. Historians still argue whether giant myths rose from real geological events, volcanoes, earthquakes, floods, filtered through terrified human eyes. But step by step, you sense how a land so fierce practically demands a legend large enough to match it. Look around, those cliffs rising sharp as a knife, the black forests swallowing daylight. even the creaking ice that seems to breathe like some slumbering beast. No wonder the Vikings imagined giants lurking just beyond view. You can almost see them yourself if you stand still enough, letting your mind slip loose into old fears. And while you stand there, a random detail flits across your thoughts. The Vikings had a saying, "The land owns you." Not you owning the land, but the land claiming you. That's the heart of it, isn't it? In a place this savage, you bow your head to whatever spirits rule it, including giants. Some fringe tales even say the giants lived inside mountains, shaping the peaks with their own bodies. That ridge might be a giant's spine, the riverbed its hand reaching for the sea. It's easy to scoff at such ideas from a warm modern apartment, latte in hand, but look around you here. If you see snow eating a forest alive, or hear the groan of a glacier splitting open, you might find yourself offering a quick prayer to someone, anyone, who could tame that kind of power. You think of a lone farmhouse perched in a fjord valley, its sod roof half buried by winter drifts. If you lived there, if you watched storms swallow your neighbors and wolves slip from the trees to drag off your livestock, would you not wonder if a giant had cursed you? Even a tiny coin left on a rock seems worth the trade, just to buy another calm night. There's a quirky detail here. Some rune sticks dug up near Trondheim mention giants in weather spells. You might grin, because yes, apparently they had a rune that read something like, "Keep the giant away from our meadows." Picture a worried farmer carving that, while the sky went black with thunder, hoping to keep his hay standing. As you follow the icy track, the sense of how real giants felt to these people starts to sink in. It wasn't just a myth. It was their explanation, their shield against a world that had no sympathy for weakness. When rivers broke their banks and took a family's harvest, it felt personal, like a giant had come to claim its due. You pass a boulder, half buried in moss, cracked by centuries of frost. In the firelight of a longhouse, that stone might look exactly like a hunched, sleeping shape. It's no wonder the sagas painted giants as part of the landscape. Slow, old, impossible to kill. They were there before you, and they would be there long after you were gone. And isn't there a kind of dark poetry in that? You respect what outlives you, even if you fear it. You bow to it, leave offerings, keep its name alive. You might even tell your children to watch their step, to never swear at the wind in case a giant overhears. The night deepens as you stand on this path, the moon lighting every icy crag in sharp white. You hear the creak of wood, a distant rush of water under the ice, and the silence between each sound is huge, large enough to fit a giant, should you choose to believe. You breathe out, slow and steady, tasting the crisp cold that bites the lungs, feeling a strange gratitude that your own world is smaller, gentler, because you know the Viking world did not pretend to be gentle, and in its harshness, giants made sense. As you step toward the next chapter, your feet crunching through the frosty dirt, remember the chill of these old stories. Next, you will follow the bloodlines themselves, where heroes claim giant ancestry, mixing fear with a strange kind of pride. You walk onward, boots biting into the frosted ground, feeling the echoes of those giant-shaped fears still tugging at your shoulders. But here, the story takes a stranger turn, because among the Vikings, it was not enough to fear giants. Some went even further, weaving giants into their own family trees. You duck into a smoky hall lit by whale oil lamps, where a skald recites verses about heroes whose mothers were giantesses, whose fathers claim to have bested a frost giant in single combat. You raise an eyebrow, but no one else seems surprised. These stories slip across the hall with a casual certainty, as if it's perfectly normal to have a grandmother with skin like glacier ice. Bloodlines, in the Viking imagination, were never neat or pure. They were tangled, wild, and often laced with danger. Claiming descent from a Jötun wasn't shameful. It was powerful. It meant you had ice in your veins, strength beyond normal men, and a streak of unpredictability the gods themselves might hesitate to challenge. Think of the trickster Loki, sometimes called a god, sometimes more a giant, with blood that connected him to the deepest chaos. Or the hero Egil Skallagrimsson, whose family sagas hint at giant-like ancestors on the stormy coasts of Norway. Historians still argue whether these genealogies were invented to make the story spicier, or if they reflected genuine pride in a rough, oversized lineage. It's almost a brag if you look at it sideways. Imagine boasting, "My granddad was a literal mountain." That would shut up any rival in a beer hall pretty quick, wouldn't it? In a world where strength and fear commanded respect, having giant blood was the ultimate trump card. You pause near the hearth, studying the rough faces around you. These are not soft people. They live by axe and oar, by gut and nerve. If they wanted to link themselves to something as merciless as a glacier, or as unstoppable as a thunderstorm, you could hardly blame them. Better to say you're kin to the terror than to be its victim. And beyond pride, there was strategy. If your clan claimed giant ancestry, you hinted at an alliance with the untamable. You suggested you could call on that unstoppable power, that maybe a Jötun would spare you while flattening everyone else. That rumor alone could keep neighbors in line. One odd tidbit you catch as the night rolls on. A rune staff found near an old trading port shows a family line proudly marked with the name Half Jötun. You grin a bit at the idea of some rugged chieftain literally branding their descendants part giant. There's no shame in it, only a kind of wild triumph. You can practically see the logic. If the land is brutal, if giants rule its dark corners, then to survive, you might as well claim them as your cousins. It is a hedge, a kind of spiritual insurance policy. The mountains may kill you, but they'd think twice if your blood sang their own song. As the fire pops and flickers, the skald's voice lowers, describing a great wedding feast where a giant's daughter married a mortal hero. Guests whispered that their children would have hands big enough to grip the world. You smile at that. It's ridiculous, sure, but it also feels oddly hopeful, like the dream that even monsters might share their strength with you. You lean back against a rough wooden post, closing your eyes for a moment. There is something familiar about this pattern. Even today, people brag about having royal ancestors or noble blood, or connections to some distant mythic figure. The Vikings just took it to another level, swapping kings for frost giants. The night grows deeper, the wind gnawing at the hall's walls. You hear the old voice carry on, chanting of children born with giant hearts, of warriors so strong they broke a horse's spine with a single blow. Wild exaggerations, you think, but you also sense the truth underneath. These people wanted to belong to something bigger, stronger, more enduring than any single fragile human life. It is almost gentle, in a strange way, to imagine a giant grandmother watching over you from the mountains, her huge hand shielding you from the worst storms. The same grandmother who might smash a rival ship like a toy. Family is family, even if they measure 30 feet tall. The flickering light plays tricks on your eyes. For a moment, you could almost swear a massive shadow stirs behind the rafters, ducking its head so it won't knock the roof loose. A playful illusion, maybe, or maybe a memory. That's what these tales do. They keep giants alive, just beyond the edge of firelight. And as you stand, stretching the ache from your shoulders, you sense that tomorrow's journey will show you more than bloodlines. You will step into places where offerings still lie waiting, where the very earth feels sacred to these colossal beings. So don't get too comfortable. There's more lurking in the night. You step out of the hall and back into the night. the chill like 1,000 tiny needles against your skin. Somewhere ahead, deeper in the valleys, lie hidden shrines, quiet places where Viking folk once knelt to leave offerings for giants. You walk carefully, as if every stone might be a listening ear, every breeze a watchful eye. There is no grand temple here, no carved stone ring gleaming under the sun. These shrines are simpler, almost secretive. A bowl tucked under a boulder, blackened with ancient offerings. A small mound of bones hidden under pine roots. You kneel and study them, feeling the raw honesty of these gifts. Nothing fancy, no gold or jeweled chalices, just bread, meat, maybe a twist of fish, offered to a power too enormous to bribe, but perhaps willing to be appeased. It makes sense, doesn't it? If you believe a giant lives in the cliffs above you, you feed it. If you fear a giantess might steal your harvest's warmth, you leave a cup of milk at the edge of the field. Historians still argue whether these gifts were truly religious or just another kind of insurance policy. But in a world where a single frost could starve a family, you'd try anything to stay on the good side of the land itself. One quirky record comes from a monk's scribbled travel notes, describing how villagers in Norway piled driftwood under a rock they called the Giant's Seat, then set it on fire each year. They claimed the burning heat kept the frost giant away for another season. Imagine that, sacrificing fire to a creature of ice. There's a logic there, if you squint hard enough. As you walk on, you spot more of these subtle altars. Smooth river stones laid in a careful circle, chicken bones arranged in a spiral, even a single carved stick showing a massive face, half broken by time. None of it looks grand, that's the point. These were offerings by ordinary people, terrified that the next avalanche or flood might sweep away their entire world. There's a humility in these small gifts, a reminder that the Vikings, for all their boldness, knew their place in nature. They might conquer a village, they might sail across the sea, but they could never conquer the land itself. And if the land was ruled by giants, well, best to stay polite. You hear the hush of the forest again, that strange, heavy silence between each gust of wind. It feels as if the trees themselves are listening. You breathe carefully, almost worried you might offend something older than language, something that does not care for your pride. In these places, it is easy to believe that giants might still exist, crouching in the caves of your nightmares. You see how the ground is cracked with deep fissures, how the water runs red with iron, as if stained by some ancient blood. Every broken branch could be a clue, every echo could be a footstep, and there's a strange comfort in that. These shrines are a form of respect, a recognition that you cannot master every force that shapes your life. Modern minds love to measure and predict, to chart each risk on a tidy spreadsheet. But these offerings say something simpler. You live here at the mercy of something far bigger, and you will honor it, whether it hears you or not. You think about how many shrines must have vanished, lost to time, or bulldozed under churches and new farms. You wonder how many pieces of bread, how many coins, how many whispered prayers once littered these cold stones, all to keep the giants satisfied. And as you trace a finger along a ruined stone, you feel a flicker of respect for those who lived by that logic. They did what they could, even if the world seemed impossible to please. Better to leave a scrap of food than nothing at all. Better to speak a name than stay silent. That is the deep lesson these shrines leave behind. A horse nickers in the distance, breaking the spell for a moment. You smile, realizing that no matter how frightening the giants seemed, daily life went on around them. People still plowed fields, still fell in love, still argued over fishing nets. The giants might rule the cliffs, but the people ruled their own small circles. You stand and brush frost from your hands, feeling the warmth of your own breath. Ahead waits another layer of this world, where not only offerings but visions shaped entire lives. You will meet prophets and hermits next, those who claim to speak with giants, whose dreams guided villages through winter's worst. That will be your next step. So steady your heart, because in the Viking mind, even visions could be claimed by these colossal beings. You leave the hush of the hidden shrines behind, following a narrow trail up into stony hills where the wind slices through you like 1,000 tiny blades. Here, where even trees seem afraid to grow, you find the prophets and hermits, people who claim to dream with giants, to speak their language, to hear secrets straight from Jotunheim. The sagas mention them almost reluctantly, these odd souls who lived at the margins of Viking society. They wore ragged cloaks, carried carved staffs, and spoke in riddles about coming storms, shifting ice, and the will of the giants. You step carefully among their half-collapsed turf huts, the roofs sagging under centuries of snow, and you can almost hear voices whispering through the cracks. Some Viking villagers respected these hermits, seeking them out in desperate winters when the weather refused to break. If the gods stayed silent, maybe the giants would answer through these lonely seers. Historians still argue whether these prophets were mad, brilliant, or just master manipulators, but the stories say they had a strange power that made even jarls pause before mocking them. You think about that for a moment, trying to picture how it felt to stake your survival on a wild-eyed dreamer who claimed to have spoken with Thrym, king of the frost giants. What if they were wrong? What if they were right? It was a terrifying gamble, but so was the Viking world in general, where any year could bring famine, disease, or war. There is a fringe story, probably a rumor stretched over centuries, about a woman called Ormhild who lived alone on a headland, reading the clouds like runes. They said she once predicted an avalanche so precisely that no one in the village dared question her afterward. You can almost smile, imagining a grumpy Viking chieftain bowing to a hermit's cryptic warnings, if only to be safe. These seers were rarely welcome into comfortable halls, though. You see how the villagers might come to them for blessings and then leave them alone in the night, too unsettled to invite them home. There's something eerie about people who claim to hear giant voices. It feels like they might bring some of that unstoppable power with them, even if they tried not to. You stand by one of their abandoned fire pits, ash still clinging to the stones after who knows how many winters, and sense the uneasy respect these prophets inspired. They didn't wear gold, didn't swing a sword, but somehow their half-whispered warnings had the weight of mountains. It's almost funny, really. These were people who could not even afford a decent pair of boots, yet the entire village would hush if they started to speak. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear how they might have spoken, calm, low, unhurried, letting every word land like a drop of water, freezing solid. They told of giants stirring, of hunger coming on giant feet, of storms shaped by hands taller than the tallest shipmast. You would have felt a chill hearing that. And maybe you still feel a chill now, just imagining it. One carved staff, dug up near a river crossing, shows a pattern of swirling ice and towering figures, almost dancing around a small human. Some believe that was a prophet's staff, a symbol of their role as go-between, human and giant in the same breath. You run your fingers along the carved grooves in your mind, thinking how even the simplest objects can hold centuries of fear. It is a hard way to live, cut off from others, burdened by visions of doom, speaking for beings no one else dares name aloud. You wonder what it did to their minds, these prophets and hermits, to feel so close to something enormous and alien, to carry a secret that weighed as heavy as a mountain. It might break you, or it might make you stronger than any war chief, depending on which way your heart turned. You glance around, noticing how the hills seem to lean closer, as if listening, just like the villagers once did. The night feels very large again, very cold, and very ready to swallow up any voice that dares challenge it. You draw your cloak tighter, thinking about how fragile your own hopes might seem in comparison to a giant's indifference. Yet somehow these seers found a way to survive, to keep their place even while dancing at the edge of the known world. Perhaps that is the biggest lesson of all, that even in a land of heroes and gods, the truly powerful voices sometimes came from the smallest fires, from the strangest corners, from those who saw giants not as enemies, but as part of the same merciless pattern. You step away from the half-crumbled turf hut, its doorway still facing the rising sun, as if waiting for another dreamer to take shelter there. Ahead lies a new challenge, because soon you will see how giant worship collided with Christianity, and how that battle reshaped faith across the north. You move down from the hills, back toward clustered farmsteads where church bells now toll across the frostbitten air. Here, a new power has arrived, carried by priests with shaved crowns and polished crosses. Christianity, hungry to claim every soul in the north, stands ready to clash with old giant worship in a battle fought more with words than swords. You slip through a narrow lane where villagers gather, half listening to a monk preaching about sin and salvation. The monk's Latin rolls over the crowd like a distant tide, but you catch a note of worry in his voice. Why worry? Because he knows what you know. That giant worship is stubborn, rooted deep, older than the church's walls. Picture the farmer who still leaves a crust of bread on a cold boulder just in case, even after Sunday Mass. Or the grandmother who mutters a prayer to Scotty before the harvest, despite the priest's sermons. The old beliefs never vanish overnight. They linger like moss on stone, refusing to be scrubbed away. Historians still argue whether priests truly converted these people, or merely bully them into pretending. You stand near the church door and hear a woman slip a giant's name into a prayer under her breath, hedging her bets. The faith of the North was never simple and never pure. The monks knew the danger. In their letters, you sometimes see frustrated warnings that people still feared the giants more than they feared hell. Can you blame them? Hell was a far-off place, an idea, but a giant might tear down your roof tomorrow, right in front of you. One fringe story from Iceland says a bishop tried to build a chapel on a hill rumored to belong to a frost giant. Every time they set the beams, a storm destroyed them. Finally, the bishop paid a local seer to ask the giant's permission, and only then did the chapel stand. You have to laugh a little at that. Even a bishop had to negotiate with the old powers. You breathe in the sharp smoke of peat fires, watching children run around the graveyard, playing their games. You hear them chant half-familiar rhymes, naming giants you'd thought lost to time. And you realize how deeply these stories are braided into their souls. Christianity might promise a heaven of singing angels, but the giants were here, in the land, in the wind, in the rock under their feet. There is something almost beautiful about that stubbornness. The Vikings refused to give up their relationship with nature, even under threat of excommunication. If the priest god wanted respect, he had to stand in line behind the land itself. As you follow the gravel path, you spot a carving on a church door, its lines rough and hasty. Someone scratched a giant's rune there, hidden in the flower patterns. You smile, because that is Viking faith in a nutshell. A handshake with new beliefs, but fingers crossed behind the back, just in case. One of the monks you overhear seems weary, repeating sermons about love and mercy, but his audience glances out the windows toward the mountains, half listening. They know where real terror lives, and where real blessings might come from. You step closer to the altar and see a painted image of Christ fighting a serpent, but the faces watching seem to see a different tale, maybe a giant in disguise, maybe a Jotun hero retold in foreign clothes. You think of all the folk who nodded along, but in their hearts still imagine Thor or Skadi standing behind their shields. In a way, you can't blame them. Giants fit the land. Christianity brought distant promises. Giants explained the ground shaking under your boots, the flood devouring your sheep, the sudden snows. It was a question of immediacy, and survival is always more powerful than abstract salvation. The night falls deeper as you pass into a side chapel, candles flickering. You wonder if, hidden among the wax drips, someone left an offering for a giant, hedging against the risk that heaven might look away. The Vikings were nothing if not practical. Worship Odin on Monday, a frost giant on Tuesday, Christ on Sunday, covering every angle. And so, the new faith grew, yes, but it twisted around the old roots, never quite tearing them out. That's why the sagas survived, why the giant tales endured, why even now the mountains seem alive if you look at them with the right kind of eyes. As you leave the church, you feel the tug of the past and future fighting inside these people. The monks' words ring hollow against the sheer cliffs that watch the village like patient gods. And you realize the giants were never fully defeated, only renamed, only half forgotten. The path ahead will take you deeper still to see how giants live on in stories, reshaped and retold by poets and chroniclers long after the Vikings were gone. Keep walking. The echoes are far from finished. You walk away from the church, the iron bell fading behind you, and turn down a rough trail that runs beside a restless stream. Here, water chuckles over stones as if telling old secrets, carrying scraps of memory toward the sea. And it's there, in the words that survive on wind and water, that the giants find new life, through poetry, saga, and fireside story. The Vikings were master storytellers. You can see that plainly in the way they wove giants into every kind of tale, from children's riddles to blood-soaked warrior boasts. You step through a doorway into a smoky hall once more, where a skald is leaning against a post, reciting verses by the flicker of pitch torches. The names ring out: Hrungnir, Thrym, Bergelmir, Skadi. Each name is a spark, keeping these colossal beings alive long after the world around them has changed. You settle on a rough bench, hearing the sagas retold with just enough sarcasm to make even a giant's cruelty sound human. One moment they are monstrous, breaking ships in half. The next they are foolish, bested by a clever human. The poets knew how to keep their audience awake through the dark winter nights, balancing fear and humor with a deft hand. Historians still argue whether the sagas were truly remembered word for word, or endlessly reinvented. You suspect it was both, memory mixed with imagination, shaped by each teller's mood and each listener's hunger for wonder. Giants were too big to pin down in one single version. They grew and shifted in the retelling, just like the land itself. You catch a quirk of these sagas that makes you grin. Some describe giants as picky eaters, refusing certain animals or demanding their food cooked a special way. It feels so oddly human. You can almost picture a frost giant complaining about burnt goat. Those little details turn terror into something you could laugh at least around the safety of a warm fire. And it worked. Giants and stories became something more than just enemies. They became reminders. They taught about pride, about limits, about the dangers of forgetting your place in a wild, ungovernable world. A hero might defeat a giant, but never without cost. A lost hand, a broken sword, a haunting nightmare. These stories warned you as gently as they thrilled you. As you listen, you notice the skald's voice dropping lower, sinking into the long stretches of silence between the verses. That rhythm feels familiar, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. It lulls you, calming even as it describes a giant tearing roofs from houses. Because these tales were made to soothe as much as to scare, to help people sleep knowing that giants could be named and named things could be survived. Some fringe scholars say the giant stories acted like group therapy. Everyone sat together, sharing the same dread, and then reshaping it until it could be carried. There's something beautifully human in that. You glance around the hall, noting how faces relax, eyes go soft, shoulders lose their tension while the skald sings on. These giants, so fearsome and strange, become a kind of friend when handled by the voice of tradition. They pass from monstrous to memorable, from destroyer to teacher. And you can see how, even centuries later, these old poems still echo in modern stories, quietly living on in fairy tales and fantasy novels. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, jolting you back. You stand, stretching cramped legs, and catch the skald's final words about a giant who chose peace, settling down to guard a mountain pass rather than destroy it. A final reminder that even in their worst telling, giants could surprise you. The night air hits your face like a slap of ice, but you don't mind. You feel steadier for having heard these stories, steadier for knowing that language itself is a shield against fear. A giant named and retold is never quite as dangerous as a giant you try to ignore. So you turn your steps down the next path, where you will see how the very landscape, cliffs, rivers, and sea kept these legends alive, binding them into place names and local tales that refuse to die. That is where you'll go next, into the land itself, where giants still sleep beneath your boots. You follow the winding trail away from the hall, your boots crunching across ground so old it feels like walking on the bones of the earth itself. The night is nearly absolute, stars wheeling overhead in a slow, silent procession. Here, the land itself seems alive, and filled with the echoes of giants who refuse to vanish completely. It is no accident, you notice, that mountains still bear giant names. You cross a pass the villagers call Thrym's Gate, and see a looming cliff known as Skadi's Bed. Even after Christianity came, after sagas faded, after swords rusted, these names stayed, holding on like stubborn moss. Place names are a kind of memory, older than writing, impossible to erase. Historians still argue whether these names were deliberate acts of defiance or simply the natural way a story clings to a place. You suspect it was both. The Vikings saw no contradiction in living among giants, in marking the land with their titles, as if to say, "We remember you, we respect you, we fear you, but we will still farm beneath your shadow." As you walk, you trace your fingers along stones carved with rough images of giant faces, half lost to wind and rain. They stare back at you with patient, unblinking calm, like guardians or jailers. Who can tell the difference? Some local legends say if you whisper to these stones on the coldest nights, the giants will answer. Maybe they never truly left. You catch one particularly quirky story about a river said to flow from a giant's tears after he lost a wrestling match against Thor. It's funny, really, a monstrous being weeping like a disappointed child. And yet somehow that makes the land gentler, more human, easier to live with. These myths soften the world, even as they explained its terrifying power. You wander past a hill whose silhouette looms like a sleeping figure wrapped in twilight. The villagers still refuse to cut wood there, in case they disturb the giant's dreams. You have to smile at that. Respect for the land turned into respect for its oldest, most impossible inhabitants. All around you, it feels as if the soil itself is woven through with giant blood. The way some people say, iron gives the land its red stain. Everything here, the cliffs, the rivers, the meadows, has a giant story attached, like a second skin. And in that web of stories, the people found belonging. They were not alone against the howling winter, not alone in a place where storms could destroy their tiny hopes. They had the giants, for better or worse. You step down to a rocky shoreline, waves slapping gently at black pebbles, and listen to the hush between each swell. That hush feels older than any prayer, older than any saga, carrying the slow heartbeat of the land itself. In these names, these landmarks, these half-told tales, you see a kind of quiet resistance. Nothing dies entirely if it is spoken of, even a frost giant. In fact, you can feel them around you, as if every echo that bounces off the cliffs is carrying a giant sigh. That is the deepest legacy of giant worship among the Vikings, a sense that no matter how powerful you are or how powerless, you belong to the same vast, unpredictable, dangerous, and beautiful world. Giants reminded the Vikings of humility, but also of courage, of the need to keep trying even against forces too big to truly fight. You glance toward a hill crowned with wind-twisted pines, where the villagers still leave a crust of bread once a year. That ritual will outlast any sermon, any law, any king's decree, because when you live among storms, you make peace with them, and when you live among giants, you keep their names alive, even if you half believe and half fear them. Your steps grow slower now, breath coming easier as you realize your path has come full circle. That's colossi, whether real or not, shape the land, the minds, and the hearts of Viking people. And through them, you. The wind still howls, but it feels like an old friend, its cold bite familiar rather than frightening. The land holds its secrets close, but it has shared enough for tonight. As you stand there, letting the air brush across your face, you understand. There will always be giants here, as long as someone remembers them. Your breathing slows, the night settling gently around you like a heavy wool cloak. You hear only the quiet rush of air and the soft, endless hush of waves on distant shores. Your body feels heavier now, sinking into warmth, your mind drifting with the same slow rhythm. The giants you met tonight, in hills and poems, in carved stones and whispered prayers, seem to fade into the twilight, stepping back across the border of dreams. Their enormous shadows soften, no longer menacing, but patient, watchful, waiting until someone calls their names again. Feel your heartbeat calm, steady, comfortable in its smallness. The Vikings understood how small they were too, surrounded by forces they could never master. And maybe there is peace in knowing that, a sense that you do not need to control everything, that the wind will blow, the rain will fall, and you will simply endure as they did. Let your thoughts ease, as if the sagas themselves are closing a great leather book, its stories safe for another night. There is nothing more you must do. You are safe, sheltered by modern walls, far from storms, far from giants, resting in the quiet certainty that dawn will come again. Breathe in deeply, and as you let it go, let the worries of the day slip away, like old footsteps lost on the path behind you. The past sleeps now, waiting. The giants sleep too, and you can sleep, carried by the same earth that once carried them. Good night, traveler.